My name is Margaret, and for most of my life, I believed I had a loving family. I cooked for them, cared for them, and gave them everything I had. I never imagined that the very people I raised, the ones I trusted most, would betray me in a way I still struggle to understand. One week, I went to visit my sister, thinking nothing of it. When I returned, the house I had worked my whole life for, the place filled with memories of my late husband and children, was gone. Sold, not by strangers, but by my own family. I stood there holding the key to a door that no longer existed, fighting back tears. The easy thing would have been to scream, to beg, to fight, but I didn't argue. I stayed quiet, because what they didn't know was that my silence was not weakness. It was the beginning of a plan for revenge they would never forget. I remember that day as if it were carved into my bones. The air was crisp, a gentle wind brushing against my cheeks as I carried my small overnight bag up the familiar street I had walked for decades. I had just returned from visiting my sister. It was supposed to be a simple, joyful trip, a week away to share stories, cook old family recipes, laugh about childhood memories, and rest my tired bones. My heart was light, even hopeful, but nothing could have prepared me for what I saw when I turned the corner. Where my home once stood, the little house I had built my life in, the home that held my children's laughter, my late husband's voice, and my own quiet prayers, there was nothing. Not an open door, not a broken window, not even the peeling paint I always meant to fix. Just silence and emptiness. I froze. My body locked in place as if the ground itself had betrayed me. My eyes darted from the front yard, where my rose bushes should have been blooming, to the porch where my husband once sat every evening. But all I saw was a stranger's car in the driveway, and boxes stacked inside through the window. At first I thought I was confused. Maybe I turned too soon. Maybe I walked to the wrong house. I pulled out my keys, my hands trembling, and stared at the small piece of metal I had carried for years. It was warm in my palm from my grip, but when I slid it into the lock, it didn't fit. The key, my key, no longer belonged. I stepped back, my heart thundering in my chest. That's when the door opened and a woman I had never seen before stood there. She looked at me with a puzzled expression, clutching a coffee mug. "Can I help you?" she asked. My voice caught in my throat. The words barely escaped. This is my home." Her expression hardened. "No, ma'am. This is my home. We bought it last week." The world tilted. Bought it. Bought. My home. My mind reeled, spinning in circles as if trying to untangle a cruel riddle. How could they have bought it? Who would have sold it? And then, the truth hit me. It wasn't strangers. It wasn't a mistake. It was them. My own family. My knees nearly buckled beneath me as the realization sank in. My children, the very people I gave everything to, the ones I sacrificed my life for, had sold the only place I had left. My husband's memory, my years of struggle, my little piece of safety, all gone. And they hadn't even told me. I stood there, tears stinging my eyes, clutching that useless key in my hand. A key to a door that no longer existed. A key to a life they had erased while I was gone. It felt like someone had reached inside my chest and torn out my heart with bare hands. I thought about every sleepless night when I stayed up to feed them, every shift I worked to pay for their education, every birthday I saved pennies just to make them feel special. And this was how they repaid me. The woman at the door grew uneasy, perhaps sensing the storm in my eyes. She told me she was sorry, but this was her house now. She shut the door gently, but to me, it slammed like thunder. I stumbled back to the street, gasping for air, like the world had suddenly grown too small to hold me. The familiar neighborhood, the trees, the sidewalks, the mailboxes I had passed 1,000 times, now felt foreign. Each house whispered betrayal. Each passing car seemed to mock me. I sat down on the curb, clutching my bag, And for the first time in years, I broke. The sobs came in waves, shaking my body, tearing through the silence of that once friendly street. I felt abandoned, erased, disposable. But after the storm of tears, after my voice cracked and my chest burned, something inside me shifted. I wiped my face with the back of my hand and looked again at that house. Yes, they had taken it from me. Yes, they had stolen the roof from over my head. But what they couldn't steal was the strength that had carried me through decades of hardship. I remembered my husband's words, whispered to me on nights when life felt unbearable. Patience is power, Margaret. Never waste it on rage. Save it for the moment it matters most. And so I sat up straight, tucked that useless key into my pocket, and took a deep breath. I would not scream. I would not fight. I would not beg for what was already gone. No. I would wait, and I would plan, because betrayal may have stolen my home, but it had also given me something far more dangerous. Quiet resolve. And they would never see what was coming. I could have stormed into their homes that very night. I could have thrown open the door, demanded answers, screamed until my voice was hoarse, and demanded that they return what was mine. That's what any hurt mother might have done. That's what my neighbors would have expected me to do. But I didn't. I chose silence. And that decision, though it tore at me, was the beginning of everything. When I discovered my home was gone, my heart begged for confrontation. I imagined standing in front of my children, pointing my finger at them, demanding to know how they could betray their own mother. I imagined their excuses, their lies, their faces full of guilt, or worse, indifference. But then I asked myself, what would that give me? Anger might have satisfied me for a moment, but it wouldn't give me back my house. It wouldn't heal the wound of betrayal. And it certainly wouldn't teach them the lesson they needed to learn. I had given them enough of my life, enough of my voice, enough of my tears. This time I would give them nothing. Nothing they could fight against. Nothing they could twist. Nothing they could use to call me bitter or hysterical. I would give them silence. At night, when the world was quiet, I sat alone with my thoughts. Memories of my husband came rushing back to me. His voice was steady, his advice always clear. Patience, Margaret. Patience is power. Don't waste it on shouting. Save it for when it matters most. I remembered how he used to play chess on the old porch, moving his pieces slowly, always thinking 5 steps ahead. He once told me that the game wasn't about the move you made now, but about the trap you set for later. That stuck with me. My children thought they had won. They thought I was powerless, homeless, broken. But the truth was they had only moved one piece on the board. The game was still mine to play. So instead of confronting them, I began planning. Quietly, secretly, patiently. I went to the library where nobody asked questions, and I pored over books and newspapers about real estate. I borrowed a laptop from my sister and searched late into the night about property deals, auctions, foreclosures. I learned about deeds, mortgages, and sales. Each click of the mouse, each turn of the page fueled a fire inside me. I wasn't just learning about houses, I was learning about power. And the more I read, the clearer my vision became. I didn't want just another roof over my head. No, I wanted something far greater. Something that would remind them every single day of what they had done and of what I had become. There were nights I cried myself to sleep, staring at that little key that no longer opened a door. But by morning, I woke with new determination. I visited open houses pretending to be a curious passerby. I sat in coffee shops listening to agents gossip about properties going on the market. I kept notebooks, hidden deep in my bag, filled with scribbles about street values, ownership records, and upcoming sales. My children had taken one house from me, but I was quietly mapping out how to take something far greater. It wasn't easy. I had doubts. I wondered if I was too old, too tired, too unprepared to step into a world of contracts and negotiations. Sometimes I wanted to scream, to burst into their living rooms and demand they face me. But every time the temptation rose, I pressed my lips together, closed my eyes, and reminded myself, they think I am powerless. They think I am broken, but silence is my greatest weapon. You see, silence unnerves people. It unsettles them. When you yell, people know what you're feeling. When you cry, people know they've won. But when you say nothing, they begin to wonder. I let my children believe they had erased me. I let them live in comfort, unaware of the storm brewing just beyond their sight. I smiled politely when I saw them in passing. I nodded when they offered shallow words. I acted smaller than I was, weaker than I felt, and all the while I was building something they couldn't see. Every piece of information I gathered was another brick in the foundation of my revenge. Every note in my journal was another weapon in my arsenal. I started small, researching single homes, then duplexes, then entire blocks. The more I read, the more confident I became. I reached out to old acquaintances, people who owed me favors, people who had once sat at my kitchen table and eaten my cooking. I asked quiet questions, probing without revealing too much. The answers came slowly, but they came. Opportunities opened one by one. It was like planting seeds in the dark. No one could see what I was doing, but I knew one day those seeds would grow into something far greater. There were moments when I almost broke my silence. Like the night I overheard my daughter laughing at a family gathering, bragging about how easy it had been to move on from the house. I was there, sitting quietly in the corner, pretending not to hear. My heart screamed. My fists clenched beneath the tablecloth. But I said nothing, because I knew the sweetest revenge wouldn't come from words. It would come from actions. Weeks turned into months. My notebooks filled, my plans sharpened. The betrayal that once shattered me became the very fuel that kept me alive. I stopped thinking of myself as a victim. I began to see myself as a strategist, a quiet player in a game they didn't even know they were in. And slowly, carefully, I began to move my own pieces on the board. They thought I was powerless. They thought I was finished. But what they didn't know, what they could never imagine, was that my silence was not defeat. It was the beginning of a plan that would change everything. When people think of revenge, they imagine shouting matches, slammed doors, or public humiliation. They picture fiery words and heated moments. But my revenge? It was quiet, patient, hidden in the folds of paperwork, in the fine print of contracts, in the whispers exchanged in bank offices. And it all began the day I walked into a bank with trembling hands and a heart filled with determination. The building was cold, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes you doubt yourself. I sat across from a loan officer, a young man with slicked back hair and a polite smile that didn't reach his eyes. To him, I was just another aging woman with a dream too big for her wallet. He looked at me over his glasses and asked, "So, Mrs. Harlow, what exactly are you looking to do with this investment?" I smiled politely, hiding the storm inside me. "I'm interested in properties. Entire blocks, if possible. I'd like to know what options are available." His eyebrow arched. Entire blocks. Not single homes. Not apartments. A street. He shifted in his chair, probably wondering if I had lost my mind. But what he didn't know was that my silence, my calm, was stronger than his doubt. Inside, my heart pounded. What if he called my children? What if word spread? What if the secret slipped out before I was ready? But outwardly, I was still. That was my first lesson in negotiation. Never let them see your fear. The bank officer hesitated, but eventually slid a few papers across the desk. Listings, numbers, mortgages, deeds. The papers looked like a different language to me. Paragraphs of legal jargon, columns of numbers, dates, signatures. My head swam. For a moment, I wanted to push the papers back, to say it was all too much, to run. But then I remembered standing in front of my empty house holding that useless key. And I thought, no, They took everything from me. I will not run this time. So I asked questions. Too many, perhaps. Some the officer answered impatiently, others with a sigh. But I listened. I wrote notes. I filled page after page in my notebook, determined to understand. I left that day with my head spinning, but with something far more valuable than approval: knowledge. Over the weeks, I visited more banks. Some doors closed on me. Some laughed quietly behind their polite faces. But I kept going. Then came the agents, men and women who showed me houses with bright smiles and rehearsed pitches. They saw me as an easy target, an old woman who could be tricked. One agent in particular leaned too close to me one afternoon and whispered, "Ma'am, maybe you should stick to renting. Buying's a young person's game." I looked at him with steady eyes and replied, "Young people may buy houses, but women like me, we buy streets." The look on his face was priceless. He laughed, but he also grew nervous. And that was enough. Because behind that nervousness, I saw respect. The negotiations were not easy. Every meeting felt like walking a tightrope. I had to keep my composure even when my heart raced. I had to ask the right questions without revealing my plans. At night, I lay awake in my sister's spare bedroom, stacks of papers around me, legal dictionaries open, sticky notes covering every margin. My eyes burned from reading fine print. My hands ached from signing forms, and my chest tightened with the fear that somehow my children would discover what I was doing. I was terrified of running into them at the wrong place, of them hearing my name mentioned by a careless agent, of one stray word giving away everything. So I learned to cloak myself in humility. I pretended to be smaller than I was, less capable than I felt. I let people underestimate me, because the more they doubted me, the easier it became to work unnoticed. Months passed. One property became two. Two became three. With each deed signed, with each set of keys pressed into my hand, the weight of betrayal grew lighter. I hid the paperwork in an old leather bag, carrying it with me everywhere, never letting it out of my sight. That bag became my shield, my weapon, my secret. When I looked at those crisp white deeds, the bold print declaring ownership in my name, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Power. Still, there were struggles. I argued with banks who didn't want to lend to someone my age. I faced agents who tried to inflate prices, thinking I wouldn't notice. I wrestled with city clerks who buried me in red tape. And every time I felt myself faltering, I pictured my children's smug faces. I pictured them laughing, sitting comfortably in their homes, believing I was broken. And I whispered to myself, "Silence, Margaret, patience. Let them think you are powerless." Slowly, piece by piece, the street began to belong to me. The first house was a small, run-down duplex. Nobody paid much attention to its sale. The second was a foreclosed property the bank was desperate to get rid of. By the time I reached the fifth, I knew I was close. Closer than they could ever imagine. Each purchase was a battle. Each signature was a victory. Each time I left an office with shaking hands, I reminded myself, they will never see this coming. And then, one cold morning, it happened. I sat in a sterile office, pen in hand, the last contract spread before me. My signature flowed across the page, shaky but determined. When the notary stamped the final seal, I felt a rush of triumph so fierce it nearly brought me to tears. It was done. The street, the very street my children walked on, the one they thought was theirs to laugh on, to gossip on, to live on without me, belonged to me. I walked down that street later, my steps slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial. The houses looked the same, the sidewalks cracked, the trees bare from winter. Neighbors waved, unaware of the secret I carried. But to me, it was different. Because every door, every brick, every window, it all bore my name in silence, hidden in stacks of paper they would never think to ask about. They thought they had erased me. But in the end, the very street they walked on belonged to me. I remember the day I returned like it was etched into my soul. The sky was pale, washed with the soft light of early morning, and the air carried a chill that made me pull my coat tighter around me. I walked down the familiar streets of my old neighborhood with a calm I did not yet fully feel. Every step I took was measured, deliberate, as if each footfall could somehow reclaim the dignity my children had tried to steal from me. I had left as a woman betrayed, broken, with nothing but a small bag and a heart full of hurt. But now, I returned armed with something far more powerful than anger: proof, ownership, and quiet authority. When I reached the driveway of what I had once called home, I saw the familiar faces of my family. They were gathered casually, laughing at what they clearly thought was my downfall. My daughter waved at me sarcastically, smirking. My son whispered to his wife, glancing in my direction with a condescending grin. I could hear the faint laughter, the kind that echoes with the knowledge that someone has lost in their eyes. I paused at the edge of the driveway. I smiled politely, a small, serene smile that hid every ounce of the storm churning inside me. They looked at me as if expecting tears, as if expecting weakness, and that's exactly what they got. Nothing. I stepped closer. "Good morning," I said softly, almost innocuously, as though I were greeting old friends. They froze, uncertain how to respond. "Mom," my daughter began, her tone half laugh, half nervous. You're back early." I nodded, still calm, still quiet. "Yes, I came back." Then came the moment I had been waiting for. I reached into my bag, pulling out a stack of crisp, official-looking documents. The weight of the papers in my hands felt heavier than any key I had ever carried, heavier than any burden of betrayal. These were deeds, contracts, and notices, proof that every property on the street, every house my family had walked past without thought or care, was now mine. I set them down on the dining room table with deliberate care, letting the papers slide across the polished wood. The rustle of paper seemed deafening in the suddenly quiet room. My children leaned in, curiosity and suspicion mingling in their faces. I could see the subtle shifts of unease. Their laughter faded, their smirks faltered. "Do you know what these are?" I asked, my voice calm but firm. My son laughed nervously. "Mom, are these bills or something?" I shook my head. "No, these are ownership papers. Every house on this street from corner to corner now belongs to me." There was a pause, a moment so thick, so heavy with disbelief that even the ticking clock seemed to stop. My daughter's hand flew to her mouth. You bought the whole street?" I nodded. Slowly, calmly, yes. The entire street. Every home, every property, every corner that they had ever walked on with their smug laughter, all mine. Their faces contorted in disbelief, their mouths opening and closing, as if trying to form words that could not exist in reality. My son turned pale, and I saw his knees weaken slightly as he gripped the edge of the kitchen counter. The woman he had married, the one who had called me a burden, stared at me with wide eyes, frozen in utter shock. I smiled again, softly, serenely, as if nothing had changed, and yet everything had. "I imagine this is a lot to take in," I said, "but take your time. I know it's hard to process. After all, you thought you had erased me." They did not speak. Not a word. The room was thick with tension, their disbelief pressing down on me like a tangible force. They looked at the papers on the table as if they were some sort of apparition, impossible to touch, impossible to deny. I walked slowly around the table, letting my gaze settle on each of them. I could see the fear beginning to surface, the realization that their arrogance, their laughter at my supposed helplessness, had been premature. "You see," I continued, "I didn't argue. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I simply planned quietly. And patience, as you'll discover, is a far greater weapon than any angry words. My daughter finally whispered, almost under her breath, I don't understand. I tilted my head, studying her carefully. It's simple, really. You took what you thought you could, believing I had nothing. You underestimated me. And now, you're learning the cost of that mistake. Her eyes darted to my son, who looked ready to sink into the floor. The woman beside him clutched her purse as if it might shield her from what had just been revealed. I walked back to the stack of papers, lifting the top document so they could see the official stamp. This is the deed for 102 Maple Street, I said softly. The house you walked past this morning. Mine. And the next house and the next. All mine. Every property, every corner, every walkway. Yours only by memory, not by right. The room was silent, save for the soft sound of paper shifting as they stared, unbelieving, at the proof in front of them. I saw my son's jaw tighten, his hands tremble. I saw my daughter's lips quiver as she struggled to form coherent words. And I saw the woman who had called me a burden swallow hard, as if trying to make her body believe what her mind refused to accept. I took a deep breath. Quietly, calmly, slowly. I imagine you have a lot of questions, I said. But don't worry, I'm patient. I've had plenty of time to plan this, and now you'll have plenty of time to think about the consequences of your actions. Their laughter, their smirks, their dismissive gestures from weeks ago, all gone, replaced by silence, disbelief, and the unmistakable weight of realization. And in that moment, standing in what had once been my home, surrounded by the people who had betrayed me, I felt a satisfaction so deep it was almost frightening. Not just because I had taken back what was mine, far beyond the single house they had stolen, but because the method had been mine. Quiet, patient, calculated. They had believed they had destroyed me. They had believed that my tears, my silence, my absence meant defeat. But they were wrong. In the end, every step they took, every door they opened, every corner they walked past on that street, belonged to me. And the realization slowly, painfully sank into them. Their shock, their silence, their disbelief. It was a victory more satisfying than words could ever describe. After the shock had settled, the silence lingered. A silence so heavy, so suffocating, it pressed into every corner of the house, every wall that had once echoed with laughter and chatter. My family no longer laughed. They no longer whispered behind polite smiles. Instead, they looked at me with a mix of disbelief, fear, and a creeping sense of regret that no words could undo. I watched them carefully, not from a place of triumph over malice, but from the quiet vantage of someone who had endured betrayal and had learned its lessons. I had seen arrogance. I had seen their smug confidence when they thought I was powerless. And now the tables had turned. They sold one house believing they were clever. They believed that I was weak, that my age, my quiet demeanor, and my absence were proof of my defeat. But what they hadn't realized was that true power doesn't always announce itself. True power grows silently, patiently, like a tree that bends under storms only to rise taller than ever before. I walked slowly through the street, looking at the homes now under my name. Every house, every corner, every walkway. My children had walked these streets for years, thinking ownership and authority belonged to them. And now, it didn't. I paused at the corner where my son had parked his car, a smug smile plastered across his face just weeks before. I remembered the way he had waved at me as though I were invisible, as though I were a burden in their carefully constructed lives. Now he stared at me, his expression caught somewhere between disbelief and fear. My daughter, who had once rolled her eyes at my concerns, who had called me naive and old-fashioned, now walked carefully, almost reverently, past the very properties she had dismissed. I could see the slow, dawning realization in her eyes. She had underestimated me, and the cost was visible in every deed I held. I let them stew in that moment. I did not need to gloat. I did not need to remind them of the betrayal they had inflicted. My actions spoke louder than any words ever could. Every property signed in my name was a silent but unmistakable statement. I am not weak. I am not forgotten. I am not powerless. They had learned this lesson in the harshest way possible. Without a single shout, without a single tear, without a single public humiliation. That evening, as I sat in what had once been my living room, I reflected on the long journey, the heartbreak of betrayal, the nights spent worrying and planning, the endless papers, contracts, and research, every late-night visit to banks and city offices, every agent who had doubted me, every clerk who had scoffed, every obstacle I had faced, all of it had led to this moment. I realized something profound. The lesson wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about making them suffer. The lesson was about strength, patience, and the inevitability of karma. I had been wronged, yes, but I chose not to meet malice with malice. I chose to act with strategy, with dignity, and with calm resolve. And in doing so, I had reclaimed not just property, but power, respect, and peace. They had tried to erase me with arrogance. I had returned with patience. They had assumed my silence was weakness. I had turned it into my greatest weapon. And as I watched them, trying to understand the reality of what had happened, I smiled quietly to myself. They sold one house. I gained the power of an entire street. The irony was not lost on me. Every step they had taken to assert dominance, every word of dismissal, every glance of superiority, all of it had led to this moment of profound reversal. And yet there was no need for cruelty, no need for anger. My victory was in the quiet assertion of truth. I understood now that patience was not merely waiting, it was preparation. It was the art of allowing events to unfold, while positioning oneself to act decisively when the moment was right. It was the knowledge that true power often grows in silence and is revealed only when the world is ready to witness it. In the days that followed, my family's behavior changed. Conversations grew quieter. Their laughter, once bold and dismissive, became hesitant. I could see the hesitation in their movements, the careful calculation in every word they spoke. They had been humbled, not by words, not by confrontation, but by a truth they could not fight against. I had outmaneuvered them without ever raising my voice. It was a subtle, powerful shift, one that only patience and dignity could achieve. And every time I walked past the homes, knowing the deeds were mine, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Not of vengeance, but of justice. I reflected on the lessons learned from this entire journey. Life can be cruel, and betrayal often comes from those we trust most. But anger, when unchecked, serves only to cloud judgment. Revenge, when rushed, often fails. Patience, quiet planning, and strategic thinking, these were the tools that had led me to victory. And karma, I realized, has a way of balancing the scales in its own time. My family had thought they could erase me. They had assumed they could take everything without consequence. But time, patience, and persistence revealed the truth. Actions have consequences, and those who underestimate others often learn too late that power is rarely where they expect it to be. I spent hours reflecting on the irony. The same hands that had sold my home, believing they had outsmarted me, were now powerless to reclaim it. The very streets they had walked on, filled with the memories of their arrogance, now carried the stamp of my triumph. And as I sat quietly, I realized the most important lesson of all. Strength is not always loud. Strength does not always demand attention. True strength can be silent, patient, and devastatingly effective. I looked out the window, past the neatly paved sidewalks and the familiar houses. The sun had begun to dip, casting long shadows across the street. The air was still. My family, now humbled and subdued, moved quietly, their previous confidence replaced by a slow, dawning regret. And I smiled, not out of malice, but out of understanding. I had been wronged. I had been betrayed. But I had acted wisely, with patience, dignity, and calm resolve. And in doing so, I had rewritten the story entirely. They sold one house. I gained the power of an entire street. It was a lesson they would never forget. And it was a lesson I would carry with me for the rest of my life. Standing here now, looking back on everything, I realize something that I've carried in my heart all along. Betrayal cuts deepest when it comes from the people you love, the people you trust. It wounds you in ways strangers never could. But I also learned something else, something far more powerful. Silence, patience, the quiet decisions made while others underestimate you. These are not weaknesses, they are weapons. They are the tools that can turn pain into power, sorrow into triumph, and betrayal into a lesson that cannot be forgotten. They thought they destroyed me. They thought my tears, my absence, my quiet demeanor meant defeat. But they were wrong. I came back stronger, smarter, more determined than ever. And now every time they walk past those streets, every time they glance at the homes they once thought they could claim, they will remember. They will remember the cost of underestimating me. Because in the end, the quietest actions, the calmest patience, and the deepest dignity can create the loudest echoes of justice. They thought they destroyed me, but I came back stronger, and they will never forget it.